She was a teenage peasant girl from a village no one could find on a map. She didn't come from power, didn't inherit a title, and never commanded an army by rank. Yet by the time she turned 19, she was one of the most feared and famous figures in France. And within a year, she would be betrayed, tortured, publicly humiliated, and set on fire twice. This isn't the myth of Joan of Arc. This is the truth, a brutal, politically calculated death carried out not only by the enemies she fought in battle, but by the very church she believed she was serving. Joan claimed divine voices guided her, voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret. They told her she had a divine mission to drive the English out of France and crown Charles VII as king. At just 17, she cut her hair, wore men's armor, and convinced military commanders to let her lead troops into battle. Against all logic and military tradition, she won. She lifted the siege of Orleans, changed the course of the 100 Years' War, and turned Charles from an insecure prince into a crowned king. But power rarely protects the people who gain it by faith. As quickly as she rose, the tide turned. After a failed campaign near Paris, Joan was captured by the Burgundians, French allies of the English. They sold her to the English for 10,000 lives, not as a prisoner of war, but as a heretic. And that changed everything. Because now, her fate wouldn't be decided by a sword. It would be decided by a courtroom, a bishop, and a fire. She was taken to Rouen and placed under the authority of Bishop Pierre Cochin, a man handpicked by the English crown. He was not neutral. He was not spiritual. He was political, and he had one job: destroy Joan's credibility, condemn her in the name of religion, and erase the symbol she had become. But they couldn't just execute her. That would make her a martyr. So they needed something more devastating. A trial. Joan stood trial in 1431, accused of heresy, witchcraft, and cross-dressing. Yes, cross-dressing because she wore male armor, clothing considered against nature for women. They claimed her voices were demonic. They claimed she disobeyed church authority. But the trial was never about justice. It was stacked from the start. There were no defense, witnesses, no impartial judges, no hope. She was questioned repeatedly over and over without legal counsel, without proper rest, sometimes for 14 hours at a time. And through it all, this teenage girl stood firm. She refused to betray her visions. She said, again and again, that she believed the voices were from God. When they demanded she submit entirely to the church's authority, she asked if I do. And they say my voices are false. Will you believe as the truth? Their silence said everything. They tried to trap her. If she denied the voices, she would be condemned as a liar and fraud. If she affirmed them, they would say she worshipped demons. She could not win. Eventually, they moved her from a regular prison to a secular one, meaning she was placed under the supervision of English soldiers. These weren't guards. They were tormentors. She was harassed. Her food was sometimes denied. Her cell was damp, cold, and dark. She was kept in chains, with iron shackles on her legs. She begged to be transferred to a church prison, guarded by women, not men. They refused, because humiliation was part of the plan. They didn't just want her dead. They wanted her broken. She was threatened with torture. The rack was shown to her. She was told she would be physically stretched until she confessed. But she didn't, according to court transcripts. She trembled but never gave in. Her fear was real, but her faith somehow held. Eventually, after months of pressure, a false opportunity for mercy was offered. The judges told her that if she signed a statement admitting her sins, rejecting her voices, and agreeing never to wear men's clothes again, she could be spared execution. She signed it. She was scared. She was 19, and she still wanted to live. But even this was a trap, because after signing the statement, she was taken back to the same cell, still under guard, still chained, still tormented, and within days, the real setup unfolded. Her guards removed her dress, took away all feminine clothes, and left only men's garments in her cell when she had no choice but to wear them again. They declared she had relapsed. That meant her sin wasn't just temporary, it was permanent. And by church law, a relapsed heretic must be executed without appeal. It was the final betrayal. They had forced her into violating the very conditions they used to spare her. She didn't break the terms. She was set up to break them. Now she was no longer useful. The English had what they wanted, a legal reason to burn her publicly, not just as a criminal, but as a heretic. That word mattered, because heresy meant excommunication, and excommunication meant she couldn't be buried in holy ground. She would be erased from the church, from society, from the story. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the Vieux Marche in Rouen, where a massive wooden stake had been prepared in the center of the public square. Thousands gathered, not to celebrate but to stare, not to judge, to watch a young girl burn. She was led there in a rough gray robe, under heavy guard. A priest carried a cross. She asked him to hold it high so she could see it. She asked for mercy. She asked the saints to forgive her judges. She wept, not from guilt, but from pain. They tied her to the stake with iron chains. They piled the wood high around her, and they lit the flames. As the fire rose, Joan cried out the name of Jesus again and again. Witnesses later said her voice was unwavering until the flames reached her face. Then it stopped. But the cruelty didn't end there. Her body was burned completely. But just to be sure, just to ensure she was beyond human recognition, they burned it a second time. Then a third. By the end, nothing remained but ashes. And even those ashes were not left in peace. They were scooped into a sack and dumped into the Seine River, so no one could collect relics. No grave, no marker, no closure, just silence. And yet she would not disappear. They tried to erase her by fire, but what they did instead was immortalize her in flame. Because not long after her death, people began to speak, not in protest, but in doubt. Doubt about the trial, doubt about the verdict, doubt about the justice. 20 years after Joan's execution, Charles VII, the very king she had helped crown, authorized an investigation into her case. It wasn't because he missed her. It was because her name still echoed in the streets, and her death still raised uncomfortable questions. A team of theologians and legal experts re-examined the transcripts, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed every detail of the trial. What they found was damning. They found that the trial was illegitimate, politically motivated, and in violation of church procedure. They concluded she had been denied a fair defense, coerced under false promises, and executed under manufactured circumstances. In 1456, the church officially declared her innocent. Her conviction was overturned. Her name was restored. But it was too late. Joan of Arc had already become a symbol, not just of faith, but of betrayal, not just of courage, but of corruption. She was remembered not only as the girl who saw visions, but as the girl who was set up to die by the very institution she trusted most. Her story haunted France for centuries, and over time, she was redefined again and again as a patriot, a saint, a feminist icon, a revolutionary figure. But strip all the symbols away, and what remains is something much harder to look at: a young girl, used by kings, condemned by bishops, tormented by soldiers, and burned alive in front of a crowd. A girl who never stood a chance, but stood anyway. In 1920, almost 500 years after her death, Joan of Arc was canonized by the Catholic Church, declared a saint, a martyr, a pure soul wrongfully destroyed. But this sainthood came not as a triumph. It came as a kind of apology, a recognition that she had been silenced not by God's judgment, but by human fear. Because her real power wasn't just in what she claimed to hear. It was in what she dared to say. She stood before her enemies, before bishops and priests and kings, and refused to deny what she believed, even under threat of torture, even while chained, even while knowing what would come if she didn't surrender. They said her faith was madness, that her confidence was heresy, that her armor was blasphemy. But what terrified them most was not the voice she claimed to hear. It was her refusal to obey theirs. And so they broke her publicly, and burned her twice, and scattered her ashes so no one could mourn. But centuries later, we still speak her name, not just because she fought, but because she never stopped believing that her voice mattered, even when every power in the world told her it didn't. Joan of Arc was not just burned alive. She was betrayed. She was manipulated. She was dehumanized. And even as the flames rose around her, she forgave them. This is the true cost of faith, when it threatens the powerful. This is what happens when a girl dares to lead where only kings were meant to walk. This is torture's room, where history doesn't whisper, it screams.